Hello everyone, thank you all for coming. On behalf of the host center, it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Chiew Ho. Chiew was born to a Hokkien speaking family in Singapore and then went on to study philosophy at Singapore National and then had a mysterious period of wandering in Japan I don't know too much about, but after that period was among the first cohort of the now famous MA in Buddhist Studies program at Hong Kong. And told me he has stories to tell about that experience, being among that first cohort in Hong Kong MA. After the Hong Kong MA, Stanford recruited him, and he came here to be a part of our PhD program in the Department of Religious Studies. And I think he hasn't been back since, right? It's been 13 years? 12 and a half years? 12 and a half years. And I was lucky enough that was just the moment when I came into my new job. So I got to meet Chiew and to be on his dissertation committee and become familiar with his work. And then after Stanford, he moved to Australia, where he is now a senior lecturer in East Asian Buddhism and chair of the entire Asian Studies program at the University of Sydney. Professor Ho has written on various topics, including Buddhism and violence, the problems with defining what we mean by a miracle in Buddhist context, and the iconography of Samantabhadra. But I think he's best known for arguing that in the case of certain key Buddhist scriptures, it's not enough just to read the texts and understand their contents. To fully appreciate the place of a major Buddhist text in context, it's necessary to bring it to life, to show how it relates to everything that surrounds it. So this includes the iconography and commentary and rituals that a given scripture inspires, and especially the narratives that surround scriptures, like the Lotus and the Diamond Sutra. And this attention to narratives about scriptures is best exemplified by his oft-cited book on Tang Dynasty narratives about the Diamond Sutra. So all of this together goes into writing the biography of a scripture. And already before the talk, I was talking to Miles about what biography means, so that the biography of a scripture, what that means, so the conversation has already begun. But he's writing a biography of a scripture and making it alive with the illustrations, with debate, with innovation, and especially with the narrative lore that is inspired by the scripture. So this evening's talk promises to give us a taste of this approach in a talk entitled The Tang Biography of the Lotus Sutra in Parasutraic Writings. How does a scripture live? Please join me in welcoming Professor Chiew.
I hope you can hear me. Thank you, John, for the kind introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank the whole Center for Buddhist Studies for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you, Irene, for organizing my trip, and to Paul, who is not able to be here, my supervisor, who has always been very supportive of my work, and Carl, who is sitting there. It's been a long time. I remember we were on the same flight when I was returning back to Singapore after graduation. Yeah, and Carl has always been a great source of support as well when we were here. Yeah, listening to our demands, sometimes unreasonable ones. Yeah, and so yes, it's been more than 12 and a half years. So, but it seems so fast, especially when during the COVID years, it just ran by so fast. And when we have Zoom lessons, yeah. And so this is the topic of my talk today. So I'm sure many of you know about this book, and this project began with this book. Yeah, largely, and I actually thought about doing the podcast interview yesterday, and it was also because I was somewhat uncomfortable with the way I translated the name of the two collections I'm going to show you later. This book is invaluable, but the titles also clarifies a problem. What it offers, in effect, is a reception history of the Lotus across shifting languages, communities, and historical horizons. And this mismatch between biography and history pushed me back to think of a more basic question. In what sense can scripture have a biography at all? And what would it mean to treat biography not as a loose figure of speech, but as an analytic procedure? So one useful point of entry is the interdisciplinary field often called object biography, developed across anthropology, archaeology, art history, and museum studies. So at its core, it's a simple methodological premise. Things have cultural lives, and their significance is not fixed by origin or essence, but accrues and mutates through movements across time, space, and social use. And tracing those trajectories is not merely to narrate influence, but to reconstruct the infrastructure, practices, and regimes of valuation through which an objects become legible, authoritative, and efficacious in particular worlds. So, Tang China offers unusually rich materials. For this approach, I've done the Diamond Sutra narrative, and for the Lotus Sutra, we have two collections, the Hongzan and Fahua zhuan, 8th century, early 8th century, the Fahua zhuanji or zhuanji. That's my problem, yeah, I can't decide. But in this case, if we are taking it to be a biography, then it will be zhuanji. Likely compiled in the mid 8th century. Some scholars have actually pushed it to the 9th century, which seems more probable. And mostly after Anlushan rebellion, and you'll see traces of it. Together they record not only exemplary engagements, but also the procedures by which the sutra is authenticated, transmitted, and made credible. My discussion today will focus on the second collection, and all the quotes will be from this collection unless indicated otherwise. So let's begin. When I call Fahua zhuanji biographical record of the Lotus Sutra, I do not mean that its compiler imagined the sutra as it's like a person, nor am I using biography as a decorative metaphor for history. I mean something more precise. Fahua zhuanji employs documentary procedures, selection, categorization, attribution, sequencing, and framing to render the sutra legible as something with a life in the world, with origins, transmissions, moments of obscurity and re-emergence, authorized interpreters, sanctioned forms of practice, and reproducible effects. So, biography in this sense name a method of texture organization, epistemic legitimation, a way of making a scripture's authority and efficacy readable as a matter of record. My argument is that the biography is embedded in a text structure, particularly in the first 6 of the 12 categories you see on the screen. So the right ones. So let's begin with the first category, variations in scriptural forms. Rather than opening with an origin story in the ordinary sense, this category lays the ontological groundwork for everything that follows. A human biography can take embodiment for granted. A scripture's body, by contrast, requires justification. Before the lotus can be shown to act in time, before it can generate response, merit, or deliverance, it must first be established as a stable and yet iterable texture presence. So category 1 therefore functions as an introduction that underlies the Lotus biography. It defines what counts as an authentic embodiment of the Buddha's discourse, and it does so by normalizing multiplicity. The category titles already signals the compiler's concern. The first two characters of the title, Pu Lei, points to division, classification, structural groupings. The next two, Zheng Jian, indicate expansion, contraction. The point here is not to lament texture discrepancy, but to treat it as a condition of transmission that must be conceptually managed. So Fahua zhuanji does not begin by presuming a single immutable Lotus text. It begins by accounting for variation as a structural fact. So the compiler frames the Lotus as a discourse whose original expansiveness exceeds imaginable inscription. Each chapter contains innumerable verses, so many that even pens from Mount Sumeru and ink from the ocean could not suffice to record a single chapter. Yet this superabundance does not yield a single fixed length. The Lotus can be taught in different measures by different Buddhas. So these are some Buddhas that have actually taught the Lotus before. And of course, we must consider it in cosmic time and space. So the doctrinal implication is straightforward but consequential. The Lotus is not defined by a single quantitative form. Its discourse can be fully expressed across a range of lengths. The compiler extends this logic. So the compiler extends this logic from oral expounding to material textualization. So even when condensed into a scripture, the Lotus remains complete, not because it reproduces a singular archetype, but because it preserves the integrity of the teaching structure and scope, as you can see here. So here, the contrast is explicit. A cosmic scale adequate to bodhisattva, a human scale recension adequate to practitioners in a final Dharma age. They are both presented as legitimate embodiments of the one vehicle. Completeness, in other words, is indexed to capacity and karmic condition rather than to a single maximal texture quantity. So the category closes by applying the same principle to the situations of transmission in China. Indeed, recensions written on palm leaf or cloth differ in length. Chinese presentations introduce features such as chapter titles to conform to local conventions. Yet, these are not treated as corruptions. These are evidence that the Dharma adapts its texture form with body without compromising its essential teachings. The compiler's concluding maxim is explicit. Breadth or brevity depends on the vessel. Scriptural forms may vary, but the Dharma's great principle itself remains unimpaired. So this is the operative logic of category 1. Texture variation is condition responsive, not accidental. And seen biographically, the category supplies the Lotus with corporeality. It establishes that the scripture does not possess a single frozen body, but lives across multiple embodiments that remain continuous in principle and structure. So the move is enabling. Without it, later accounts of response, proven efficacies, etc., will be rhetorically feeble, because efficacy would hinge on access to one perfect text. Once plurality is licensed and governed, efficacies become portable. The Lotus can work through the forms that actually circulate. I'll talk about that more in the later category. So displacement is strategic. The zhuanji first defines the Lotus as a transmissible textual body. Only then does it turn into problems of presence and absence across historical time. If category 1 secures the Lotus Sutra's biography in space by establishing how the same teaching can inhabit multiple textual bodies, the next categories shift the problems to time. Its guiding question is not what form the scripture takes, but when and under what conditions it becomes present. In doing so, the compiler offers the collection's most explicit temporal theory of scriptural life. The Lotus is not simply transmitted forward, it moves through pattern phases of visibility and concealment. The category opens by anchoring the scripture in a canonical scene of compilation and authorization. This sutra was compiled by Ananda. When the Buddha delivered, Manjushri was present in the assembly. He first intoned the title, and then Ananda ascended the seat to recite and compile the discourse. The emphasis here is not merely narrative. It establishes that the Lotus is spoken by the Buddha and safeguarded by recognized custodian, a framing that will matter precisely because the category concerns what happens after the Buddha's passing. From there, the compiler introduces a familiar post-parinirvana diagnosis as noble sages gradually withdraw from the world, just as the great elephant departs, its calf followed, heterodox path proliferated, sectarian authorities exclusively revered the Hinayana scriptures. Within this depiction of doctrinal narrowing, the Mahayana and the Lotus in particular becomes obscure. Yet the key term is not disappearance, destroyed or lost, but concealed. The difference is decisive. Concealment is not failure, it is a mode of preservation. The Dharma draws from ordinary circulation in order to be safeguarded until conditions are again ripe for disclosure. The compiler then substantiates this claim through a cluster of retrieval narratives that render concealment as custodial storage rather than disappearance. Two hidden Lotus versions are invoked. A Sanskrit recension safeguarded by a monk in the snowy mountains and later ordained by Nagarjuna, an immense version said to contain as many gathas as dust motes in the 10 world systems, beheld by Nagarjuna in the Dragon King's palace. The rhetorical work here is clear. The Lotus was never absent in an absolute sense. It remained present in protected repositories awaiting the right agent and the right time. Nagarjuna functions as a hinge between concealment and renewed circulation. And from this hinge, the category sketches the geography of diffusion, multiple recensions across Java-Vipa, the western regions, and early transmissions to China. That, of course, is not there. I'm not able to put them all in. Whatever the historical precision of the particulars, the function is consistent. Manifestation is narrated as historically situated with identifiable custodians, region, and texture measures. The categories culminates by placing these movements within a Mahayana eschatological frame, drawing on Nadin Mitra Vardhana, and the compiler situates the Lotus within a broader narrative of the final Dharma age, Mofa. Yet the argument does not simply reiterate a story of decline. Instead, the lotus is presented as especially destined for propagation in the final Dharma age, repeatedly naming the final Dharma the latter 500-year period within its own text, for those who are very familiar with the Lotus Sutra. So what appears at first to be a diagnosis of degenerations become in this framing the conditions and necessities renewed manifestation. This is why the compiler can state unambiguously, we understand the times of the Dharma's arising, maturing, concealment, that's in the beginning. Manifestations depend on the karmic conditions of sentient beings. The sentence does more than moralize. It governs the category, logic, characterize the title, and what matters is not concealment and manifestation in the abstract, but that they are temporally differentiated modes of presence calibrated to shifting capacities. The history of the Dharma is thus reframed not as linear depletion, but as a patterned alternation, emergence, concealment, renewed disclosure in response to the world's changing receptivity. A practical exhortation follows at the end from this temporal logic. If the lotus is the teaching single out for the final Dharma age, then encountering it now is not merely a symptom of impoverished times, but an event of karmic timing, an opportunity that must not be squandered. So with a texture body and a temporal logic now in place, the next biographical problem is historical. Through whom and by what social forms does the lotus circulate in China? Category 3 answers by treating translation as successive historical embodiment through which the sutra becomes Chinese history. The category begins with an explicit declaration of method, respectfully consulting scriptural catalogs and the like. The translation dates of the lotus comprise roughly 6 occasions. 2 features deserve emphasis. The first, the compiler frames the account as documentary grounded in catalogs, not merely inherited lore. Second, he does not say the Lotus Sutra was translated as if once and for all. He says its translation history consists of 6 temporal occasions, and this is important. Translation is thereby presented as a process unfolding across centuries, a sequence of moments through which the scripture gradually acquires a stable presence within Chinese texture and religious life. The ensuing list is carefully staged, beginning in the 3rd century and extending into the Sui. Each translation is dated relative to the Buddha's passing, inscribing the lotus into a long post-nirvana lifespan. So these are the ones. So these are not preserved as mutually cancelling additions, but as successive historical embodiments of the same teaching. What matters most here is not how the compiler interprets difference among translations. He does not harmonize this, just simply harmonize discrepancy. He treats variation as evidence of transmission and as the reason to narrate the sutra's Chinese career, as a sequence of concretely situated embodiments. This documentary framing becomes especially clear in the Sui case, the last one. The Tianping era editors do not reject Kumarajiva's version. They complete it by restoring missing portions, regularizing the corpus through repositioning chapters, adding passages, revising wording. Here the translation bleeds into collations and restoration. But the point is not arbitrary intervention. It is reverential reconstruction under historical constraint. The lotus survived not by remaining untouched, but by being handed with procedures that are themselves authorized, examined against earlier witnesses, rearranged when it's necessary, supplemented when loss is perceived, and stabilized for renewed circulation. The category then turns from text to agents, explaining why some translation endure while others recede. Kumarajiva's continuing his translation, his continuing predominance is justified through a dialogic testimony attributed to Tao Xin's exchange with a heavenly being. As you can see here, the heavenly being credits that to Kumarajiva's exceptional intelligence and Mahayana learning, the quality of his translation team, and most importantly, his translation strategy. He prioritized comprehensions over literal fidelity, thereby capturing the Buddha's intent for later generations. His spiritual attainment is invoked, and the enduring vitality of his translation is linked to an ongoing responses and confirmation across time. What is at stake is not philological exactitude as such, but soteriological adequacy. The claim that the best Chinese embodiment is the one that most successfully conveys the Buddha's intended salvific meaning under final Dharma age conditions. And translation in this framing becomes a disciplined act of reception and realization, not merely the linguistic transfer. It is also implicitly bodhisattva sanctioned, since Manjusri present and instructions hover in the background of the category's larger authorizing logic. So again, if category 3 narrates how the Lotus Sutra acquires a recognizable textual presence in China through successive translation, category 4 turns to a different biographical question. What happens after the scripture is established? How does it propagate, circulate, becomes usable across heterogeneous communities and needs? The category titles, branches, and separate circulations offers answer. Zhi suggests branching lineages and affiliated offshoots, while piercing signals separate circulation. So the compiler thus frames the lotus not as a monolithic object that settles into a single institutional form, but a generative center from which multiple coexisting devotional and textual objects unfold. After translation stabilizes, the scripture's presence, differentiations become a conditions of continued vitality. So notably, this category is not primarily about textual variation in a sense addressed in 1 and 3, nor is it concerned with narrative of efficacies at all. Instead, it maps a bibliographical ecology. The Sutra of Infinite Meaning is considered a prologue here. As you can see, the Sutra of Procedures to Visualize Samantabhadra is considered a conclusion. So, for those who know the Threefold Lotus Sutra, this is how it's conceived. And we have others, the separate circulation of specific lotus chapters, predominantly the Guanyin chapters, the chapter about Avalokiteshvara. So that circulates, that's also known as Universal Gate chapter or the Pumen Pin. And of course we heard of the Devadatta chapter as well, very famous with the dragon girl. And there are also other lotus-related dharanis that circulated. There are texts that present themselves as lotus adjacent, including apocrypha, such as the Gawang, Guanxi Yingjing. So the compiler's aim is not to synthesize these branches into a tidy system and to record and to their coexistence. The category is therefore it's actually a work of boundary making. It distinguishes legitimate offshoots recognizable as from the main sutra from those that merely resemble or trade on its authority without a proper genealogical basis. So similarity of content does not establish lineage. Authorized transmissions does. So the principle is clear. Efficacy, as you can see, as it applies to the Gao Wang, King Gao Avalokiteshvara Sutra, does not confer legitimacy. What also matters is genealogical tethering, anchorage in the Lotus Sutra's authorized transmission history. So at the same time, the category actively legitimates the independent circulations of texts that are genuine Lotus Sutra derivative. And this is especially evident in the treatment of the Pumen Ping, the Universal Gate chapter. The compiler traces its separate circulation to an account, and usually there are many stories that they use to substantiate their point. So, so this is one of them. So apparently, the compiler traces its separate circulation to an account from Central Asia, Central Indian. Instructs a gravely ill king to recite that chapter, and the chapter subsequently circulates on its own. And the point is not to present separate circulation as a regrettable compromise. It is framed as a compassionate adaptation, one that makes the lotus available in modular form without severing it from the scripture's ultimate authority. In effect, this category offers an account of modular circulation. The scripture can be accepted without being diminished, so long as the excerpt remains recognizably part of the main text and its circulation is anchored in proper lineage and competent agents. And this is how the lotus becomes practicable in the final Dharma age. It is not only a complete 28-chapter scripture, it is also a repertoire that differentiates to meet different diverse needs, available as a whole, but also as chapters, spells, and ancillary texts that travel most easily and lodge more readily in daily life. So next, Category 5 opened with a claim of scale in India alone, and this is a category about divergent interpretations. We are talking about commentary and treatises. So in India alone, the compiler states more than 50 scholars composed treatises on the sutra. He then foregrounds the authoritative figures, Nagarjuna, Stiramati, and Vasubandhu, whose commentary writings are presented as especially consequential in the wider transmissions of Lotus interpretation. So the focus then shifts to China, where the compiler records interpretive plurality as a constitutive features of the Lotus Chinese career. And a key example is the early 6th century situation surrounding Vasubandhu's Fahua Lun. Translation efforts associated with Ratnamati and Bodhiruchi, shaped by different Indian pedagogical lineages, yield divergent renderings. What could be framed as a problem is instead treated as evidence of sustained scholarly labor. The category ends with a brief but telling gesture towards the abundance of Chinese exegesis. There are also those in this land who have composed treatises, such as the Xuanlun by Jizang and others. It's kind of interesting, the Tiantai people are not here. This cannot be fully recounted, and then it continues, this cannot be fully recounted. The remark functions less as an admission of incompleteness than a sign of proliferation. The lotus has taken root and is generating its own interpretive corpus. Biographically, the category establishes the lotus intellectual career. The scripture is not only recited, copied, or venerated, it is conceptualized, intellectually engaged. Its authority is not threatened by interpretive plurality, rather, you can see that it's actually sponsored by the same emperor. Yeah. And so rather it is sustained through multiple lineage, all these activities as multiple lineages are established, and often by different routes, on the one vehicle as the organizing horizon. In this sense, the category does not present doctrine for doctrine's sake. When they talk about doctrine later on, as you will see in the prefaces. So it performs a legitimating function. It demonstrates that the Lotus efficacy is embedded in a tradition of learned scrutiny and recognized interpretive labor across two cultural spheres. All these are very important before we have accounts of efficacies. So we form temporality and Chinese embodiment, social branching, and interpretive label. Now in place, the compiler now proceeds to the final biographical problem: how to secure trust and plurality. So having established the Lotus life across embodiment, temporality, and translations, and branching and circulation, this category addresses a final enabling condition: trust. It then assembles prefatory voices attributed to eminent monks and translators, exegetes, and learned figures, each articulating why the Lotus matters and how it should be approached and what sort of authority it bears. The placement, and I'm talking about this category at this point, because this is the last of the 6 categories that are most important for our understanding of what biography, or how we can talk about biography of the Lotus Sutra. So it stands at a threshold between the preceding documentary architecture, infrastructure, whatever we can call it, and the subsequent narrative archives and many other accounts on exemplary practices and proof of efficacies. So it answers the questions the compiler anticipates from its readers. Given the plurality already acknowledged, multiple translations, restored passages, standalone chapters, divergent treatises, on what basis can one regard this scripture as authoritative and reliable? In other words, how can textual complexity coexist with confidence? And to that end, the categories gathers 7 paratexts as neutral, not neutral preliminaries, but as attestation that converts plurality into grounds of confidence. So they teach readers how to approach the Lotus amid variant embodiment, competing interpretive frames, and the practical realities of transmission. The sequence begins with people such as Hui Guan, who identifies the Lotus as one vehicle, the teachings that subsumes provisional doctrine. So he went and talked about what it actually means, etc. So it's actually more doctrinal in nature. And we have one by Sun Rui. He is one of the translator who participated in the translation. So Sun Rui follows by presenting the Lotus as its true essential, the essence of the scriptures, even eclipsing the Prajna Paramita corpus. The attribution to Hui Yuan is very interesting. It's actually absent, not there at all, only the title. And there's actually a meta citation probably by a later reductor that says, could it be that the compiler of this collection, he had referred to certain catalog, because in those catalog, Hui Yuan is supposed to have penned a preface. Yeah. But then obviously the compiler couldn't locate the preface. But it is important. Hui Yuan is such a big name in Chinese Buddhism, and so it's important to put his name down, even though we cannot find the preface. And then we have Shen Tao, of course, extremely famous, his post-translation records. And we have a preface to the 3 translations I mentioned just now. preface to what is considered the prologue of the Lotus Sūtra is really interesting, the Sutra of Infinite Meanings, and then finally a post-translation colophon of the first extant translation, the Zhen Fahua, translated I think to 86. So these are the, sorry. So the category center of gravity, however, is Shen Zhao's account of Kumarajiva's translation enterprise. What is offered is not a bare report of translation, but a narrated scene of verification. The account stresses the large assembly of monks and scholars, the rulers' participation in checking against an older text, Kumarajiva's appeal to the charge of his Indian teacher, and Yao Xing's dream, in which Samantabhadra confirms that the rendering accords with the Buddha's intent. The point is not to supply modern critical historiography. It is to present translation as a publicly witnessed and superintended event, an act whose reliability is secured through collective scrutiny and transcendental confirmation. So, this section, the materials contained, the one that is not here, so this is actually Shen Zhao, after which is actually the preface on the Sutra of Infinite Meaning. That is really interesting. And then we, of course, have the one on supplemented Lotus that plays a complementary role. As I've mentioned previously, that actually mentions the editorial interventions that have taken place, added passages, repositioned chapters, revised wording. So doing so in a register that is very transparent, very reverent, so assuring people that everything goes well, rather than undermining confidence. The disclosure itself becomes a warrant. So it portrays collation as a careful stewardship under conditions of partial loss, but not unnecessary in alteration. I find I'm in general very interested in Buddhism on the ground and things related to lay people, and I find that the one by the layman Liu Chiew is very interesting. So it is effective and sort of like is a devotional response of a learned lay person, as you can see. It describes receiving the conditions. He could not help but pause and sign, longing for these scriptures, and then we talk about the conditions of how it actually finally gets to him. And when he finally did, it describes and it says that he felt profound joy and reverence so deep that neither chanting nor dancing could express it. So positioned here, such personal response is not private sentimentality. It models the stance of receptions that the compiler will later document more widely, a form of trust expressed through bodily affect and ethical urgency. So the category closes with Dhammarakshas. So this is the sixth and the last, the seventh is Dhammarakshas colophon, which reflects on translation style, where the records, and it says, and it's not here, it says that it was trying to justify its translation style, and it says, where the record seems verbose, it is because essentials could not be omitted. Where plain, because meaning was valued over ornament. Placed at the end, and so this early voice closes a circuit of authorizations by returning the reader to the origins of Chinese embodiments. You discovered that there are 7 prefaces or paratexts. So I wonder whether Hui Yuan's it was added for the number because the significance of the number 7, and the Lotus Sutra has 7 rows. So it could be one of the considerations. Most people, I think the Chinese are actually more deliberate than we think they are. Sometimes when they write all these things, they have certain sort of agendas behind. And in this case, if you read very carefully, they wanted to convey certain things in very, very specific ways. So in biographical terms, this category functions as a means of reputation making. It shows how the Lotus accrues credibility through converging forms of endorsement, doctrinal judgments, institutional witnesses, editorial transparency, learned effect, so that the ensuing accounts that comes later will appear as intelligible expressions of the scriptures whose authority has been publicly constructed. I'll not attempt category 7 to 12. We'll be here for another 15 minutes. But the structural point is essential. After 1 to 6 have established the Lotus Sutra's textual body, temporal career, translation history, branching circulation, interpretive plurality, and grounds of trust that makes engagement intelligible, the zhuanji turns to what we might call the scripture's modes of operation, the concrete channels through which the Lotus generates response and sustains a continuing presence. The categories titles already signals the channels through which the Lotus is shown to operate. So these are the other 6. Explication is explicitly linked to response, recitations, reading, and copying, and each paired with characteristic outcomes. And listening and offering are elevated into categories in their own right. I should highlight the benefits from listening. The last 2 is actually very important because they are not found in the Hongzan Fahua, the other collection. And I think that if you think about the absence and differences among the categories, you can actually tell what this person intends this collection to be. Yeah. So again, there's certain certain ideas. So this sheet clarifies what the Lotus life looks like at the conclusion. So scripture does not live only as something privately recited, read, and copied. It lives as something heard in assemblies and sustained by social and material support. In other words, the biography culminates in not a singular heroic act, but in a repeatable ecology. Expounders, reciters, readers, copies, audience will listen, patrons will provide the conditions under which the sutra can circulate, and the sutra cult can actually be sustained over time. So the compilation closes by foregrounding Dharma offering of Dharma, which is actually the most important within the categories of offering. There are 2 accounts at the end that are of particular importance. They function as interpretive key, ranking the sustaining of Dharma, the reception, practice, teaching, support as the highest form of offering, and thereby casting the sutra's continued presence as a matter of durable maintenance rather than episodic display. So these are the 2 accounts of the 16th talk about the supremacy of Dharma offering. So that establishes that's the most important, and I think 17th sort of went on to explain what it is. So despite all the other things, these are still very important for you to do. Basically, that's the point. So we have discussed Fahua Zhuanji's categories. It is interesting to note that there are 3 categories in the other collection, Hongzan Fahua Zhuan. So there are 2. The two last categories in Fahua Zhuanji, they are actually not found here, right? And then the one I highlighted here is actually not found in Fahua zhuanji. Here absence becomes meaningful and it's not simply accidental. Fahua zhuanji lacks discrete categories for images, cultivating contemplation and abandoning the body. Yet the point is not that these concerns vanish. Rather, Fahua zhuanji repositions them in ways consistent with its processual biographical design. Images are not staged as a distinct domain, where Hongzan Fahua zhuan can present iconic media as conspicuous mode of the lotus presence. It actually talks about replicating, for example, an image of Samantabhadra, bring it into China, and then someone replicate it and create many copies, things like that. Fahua zhuanji shift emphasis towards circulation, verifications, translation chronologies, interpretive label, and authorized voices, and then the practical ecologies of assemblies and offerings, right? And the lotus leaf here lasts through the charisma of objects and through the durability of the processes. Yeah, that and also because maybe it might be more, the compiler might be more traditional because making images is not the traditional category. Cultivating contemplation is likewise not foregrounded. Rather than centering the lotus life on specialized meditative attainment, Fahua zhuanji privileges practices that are narratable, transmittable, and broadly replicable, explicable. And so we have explications, recitations, reading, and all that. So this is not a rejection of contemplation as much as a decision about which practices most effectively reproduce the scripture's presence as collective memory in public engagements. And it is not easy to do contemplation, the 90 days of seclusion and all those Fahua, samadhi that we read, right? They are very difficult. Back to the point, this category in Hongzan, right? The 3 persons, they are all Tiantai monks. And then I thought about the absence of Tiantai people in this, in Fahua zhuanji. Maybe there's some relations. The compiler, maybe he's not a great Tiantai fan. I'm not sure. Yeah. So it tells us, but the problem is we know nothing about the compiler. And there are a few articles written about him, but no conclusion. But definitely the two compilers, they are different person. Abandoning the body is not elevated into a self-standing regime in Fahua zhuanji, but it's here. Of course, James Ben has written on this, and bodily extremity remains imaginable within lotus devotion, but Fahua zhuanji declines to canonize it as a primary channel. Instead, the intensity of sacrifice is subsumed within the broader understanding of offering, in which practices are clarified and ranked through the appended discussions. And if you read the Hongzan Fahua zhuan, I think those offerings, I wouldn't say they're all offerings, because some is like, a jump down a cliff, and it's not framed as offering. Yeah. But in the Fahua zhuanji, I think when they put it into the categories of offerings, they are explicitly more like offering, like burning themselves to offer. Yeah, so I think that's a slight difference. So the result is a redirection of devotional force towards practices that are socially sustainable and normatively defensible within the collection's broader frame. And we know that such practices of burning oneself, they are contestable. Not everyone agreed to them. And of course, we know of Han Yu, who is, we're saying, those crazy Buddhists that are doing all those things is very against the Buddhists, right? And so if we understand the Fahua zhuanji to be written in compiled in the 9th century, then if it's indeed the case, then we can really understand the climate is such that yeah, it's not so good to put it as a separate category to make it stand out. Some people are unhappy with it, and then you come and say, oh, we have this category as a standalone. Yeah. So, and I think, yeah, in the 9th century, that seems not a good thing to do. So if one sentence captures all this, it is this that Fahua Zhuanji closes by defining the lotus life as an ecology of response sustained by teaching, hearing, and offering. An archive of practice and supports through which efficacy becomes possible in the final Dharma age. To conclude, let me return finally to the questions with which this study began. How does a scripture lead? The Fahua Zhuanji's answer is not through doctrine alone, but through conditions. The Lotus Sutra lives when its texture body can survive duration without losing integrity, when its presence in time can be rendered intelligible through pattern concealment and manifestations, and when its circulation is framed as urgent precisely because the scripture is situated in the final Dharma age. So it leaves when translation itself becomes historical embodiment, when multiple rendering are acknowledged rather than suppressed, when transmission is narrated through concrete acts of collation, supplementation, repositioning, revision. It leaves when branching practice and divergent interpretations are not treated as liabilities, but as evidence that scripture can sustain social differentiation and worthy of conceptual labor. So crucially, the Fahua Zhuanji does not begin, so you can see why it does not begin with those accounts and efficacy, because it first must construct authority through curated voices that the reader, on teaching the readers how to trust the lotus amid texture and interpretive plurality. So only then can it turn to respond, showing how the sutra acts in the world through the different practices, culminating in the re-ranking of devotion through Dharma offering. So if this is a biography, it's not a metaphorical flourish, it is a biographical record, a processual archive that documents how a scripture acquires bodies, etc. over time. And biography here names a method of organization, legitimation, and not a narrative trope imposed. So I think the Fahua, the Hongzan Fahua Zhuan will remain indispensable as a counterpoint, where Hongzan Fahua Zhuan promotes the lotus through exemplary, often intensified regimes of devotion. Fahua Zhuanji renders the scriptures live legible through infrastructures and procedures, categorizations, chronology, etc. So read together, the two can show that the scripture life is not simply believed in, it is constructed, activated, and maintained. So, in the collection that we have examined today invites the reconsiderations of how pre-modern Buddhist communities themselves conceptualize scriptural vitality and far from being a modern analytic imposition. The biography of the scripture emerges here as an indigenous archival practice, one that offers powerful framework for rethinking the Parasutraic corpora, devotional collections, and the social life of Buddhist texts more broadly. Of course, it can be applied to, as I said yesterday, the Pure Land scriptures, the esoteric scriptures as well. They must have Parasutraic writings surrounding them as well. So with that, I end my talk. Thank you.